Okay, does everyone have a snack? Okay, well, we'll get started. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Before we introduce our esteemed guest, Danny Ross, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Elaine Wong. I'm one of the board members of the organization Palo Alto Forward, which is a community group that educates and advocates for better housing and transportation options here in Palo Alto. And we are one of the organizers of this event tonight here with, along with the League of Women Voters Palo Alto, and I'll let Bonnie say a few words about that.
Hi, thanks, Elaine. I'm so glad Palo Alto Forward started organizing here in Palo Alto, because until recently, the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto was one of the sole voices advocating for affordable housing in Palo Alto. We've been doing that for many years. You probably know the League from around election time. We put on pros and cons and candidate forums because we believe educating voters is of prime importance. So we register people to vote because that, among our mission is to educate. But we also advocate, and we're nonpartisan, which means we don't support or oppose political parties or political candidates, but we do focus on issues that are important to us and the community, and that is, and affordable housing and housing for all is one of those issues that we believe strongly about. So if you're interested in more about the League of Women Voters, we have a website, League of Women Voters of Palo Alto, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. And I'm so glad that Bonnie actually set that history. Palo Alto Forward is a relatively new organization. We started in 2014, and this is probably our 40th event or something like that. But we've been trying to host get-togethers, lectures with experts, and panels with different folks so that we can better understand some of the critical issues in our community. So affordable housing, as Bonnie mentioned, is one of the key ones. We're just trading some stories here about crazy housing prices and how some of us are really just lucky just by sheer timing, dint of timing, to really be where we are. I count myself fortunate to be in that category, but I know many others are not. And so wanted to highlight especially this plight of affordable below market rate housing. And so we're very fortunate to have Danny Ross here with us today to kind of shed a little bit of light onto how below market rate housing gets built. I think one of the things that I also just wanted to highlight is, in addition to education, advocacy is an important component of this. Things don't just happen. People have to decide them, and community members also have to get engaged and tell their elected officials what they think works and what doesn't work, and engage in the process. And so one of the things that I just also wanted to highlight really quickly before we let Danny take the show is that coming up on actually Monday, which is April 9th, the City Council will be reviewing an affordable housing overlay, which is a pretty important policy topic. It's a priority that was set by City Council here in Palo Alto. And so a number of folks that, some familiar faces in this room, and then others who are not here as well, have been really interested in working on that as well. So if you are interested in that, please come see me or Bonnie or Danny afterwards. We're always interested in expanding this conversation. So Danny, we all came to hear you, not me. So just want to introduce Danny. Danny joined Palo Alto Housing in 2017. He's a senior project manager in the development department. He's responsible for managing all aspects of the development process, from acquisition of land through construction completion and permanent financing. Before joining Palo Alto Housing, Danny spent 4 years as a project manager for the Essex Property Trust and was responsible for managing development of several mixed-use and multifamily housing projects. Danny has over 10 years of experience in property and project management. He has managed the development of over $1 billion in real estate, including 4,500 residential units. He has a BA from the University of Colorado Boulder and an MA in City and...
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Bonnie. I'm pleased to be here. It's great to see many people here are eager to learn about affordable housing. Before I begin, just a little disclaimer. I've been in the affordable side of development for about a year and a half now. So the bulk of my experience has been really in market rate development, but we'll get to it. Development process is very similar for both. And I'll kind of go through some of the differences as well. And also, this is Affordable Housing 101, so hopefully it's not too junior for some people who might know a lot about affordable housing. I tried to stay relatively broad brush, and then we can do Q&A towards the end if you want to dive into more details. So it's no secret the mess we're in. It's a housing crisis. We hear about it every day. It's basic economics. We're in a supply-constrained market. There's only so much land. A lot of it was built out in the 60s and 70s, mostly single-family or low-density development throughout the Bay Area. And what you get when you get single-family housing, you get land that's never really changing. You have a resident who's going to defend that. And so we also have a rapidly increasing demand. We all know this as well. The tech boom brings a lot of high-paying folks to the area who are able to drive up real estate prices. The time it takes to bring a new building to market is pretty lengthy in general, particularly in California because of the process. And I'll go into more detail in a little bit. But one of the biggest things is NIMBYism, and that's not in my backyard. These are usually well-intentioned folks who don't really want to see bad things happen in the neighborhood. It's usually traffic and parking are their biggest issues. There is also a perception that affordable housing will have a negative impact on their land value, which is actually not true. We're in Palo Alto. We've got several properties. We've got over 500 units, and it does not, I can assure you, negatively impact the land value of our neighbors. And some folks just don't, frankly, like to see anything new. And so there's a resistance to sort of the community that we see. Frankly, switching from market rate development to affordable development, I really thought naively that I would be going to an environment that was much more supportive. I'm used to going to city council and defending a large mixed-use project, maybe 400 apartments, and having people very resistant to that. And they're, before my Essex days, they were luxury apartments by and large. Maybe there was a BMR inclusionary element to it. But people are very resistant to those projects. So I thought once I make this switch to affordable, everyone's going to love me and it's going to be great. That wasn't really the case. So it can be if you're in the right market. So development is a pretty risky endeavor. You're going to put up a lot of money and you might not end up where you thought you were going to be. And so you're putting a lot of capital at risk. If it's an affordable project, you're going to have to chase down the financing. So the minefield is vast. So a lot of people don't really want to get into this, and that sort of contributes to this sort of compounding issue. We've also got construction costs are more expensive now than they've ever been. Land is more expensive now than it's ever been. So providing housing in that sort of situation is really a recipe for disaster. So this is one of my favorite graphs. This was from a Spur report last summer. And this really illustrates the mess we're in, right? The blue is the jobs that have been added over the last 5 years, and the green is the housing units that have been added over the last 5 years, broken down by county in the Bay Area. And you can see no one in the Bay Area is providing housing at the rate at which we're providing jobs. So this is another interesting one. This one's a little bit more dated, but it's still relevant data. For every new tech job, there's essentially 5 local jobs that are required really to support that person. And it's any number of things. These are just sort of 5 random things. But the point is that, that there's an average of 5 jobs. And if you look, it's barber, plumber, janitor, cook, gardener. These aren't wealthy, high-paying jobs. So, these are folks that really need help in terms of finding housing. So what is affordable? HUD defines affordable as being able to spend up to 30% of your gross annual income towards housing, and that's inclusive of utilities and housing costs. And the way this gets defined locally is through our California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. We call them TCAC because it's a mouthful. So they sort of set the rents locally for us to use as affordable housing developers. And when we talk about moderate income, we're talking about 80 to 120% of area median income. When we say low income, it's at or below 80% of area median income. Very low is at or below 50, extremely low is at or below 30. And so the tax credit program, and I'll get more into this in a little bit, but the tax credit program requires a 60% AMI or below. This has changed a little bit lately. You can now go up to 80%, but you have to average for the entire project at least 60% of area median income. And if you're going to get federal loans on the project, they require a deeper affordability, so you're going to have to provide 50% AMI or below. And some sources will require you to go even lower. And one example of that is Santa Clara County's Measure A funds do require you to have, they have two categories, but essentially it's one of them requires that you have permanent supportive housing, and that's generally 30% or below. And then they'll have a set aside for another chunk of 30% or below. And then the remaining portion you can use, up to 60%, possibly 80% now with this new change. So just a quick breakdown on some of these numbers, what 100% income looks like for one person in Santa Clara County. And again, this is defined by TCAC, and this is all available online. This is, so one person in this county, it's 83,600. For the rest of the country, that's pretty high. For here, it's really tough to get by on that kind of an income, but 60% is 50,160. I won't read all the numbers, but they're there and they're available online. So TCAC takes those numbers, and then based on that, what you can afford to pay at 30% of the income level, they give you kind of the breakdown of what a developer would charge for the various rents. And so at 100% income, the fair market rent for here would be $2,090. And so I also added up there the averages in Santa Clara County, and this is from Rent Cafe, and it's a pretty reliable source. They source data and they work with property management companies all over the Bay Area. But so the average rent just in general is $2,706. And so you can see that's maybe affordable for a studio, but that's not helping, right? So a studio average rent $1,920, so the 100% income guy can probably afford that. But if they need a bigger spot, they're kind of in trouble at the 1-bedroom range where the average is 2,400 and so on and so forth. So you can really see from these numbers that it's really difficult to make ends meet even at 100% of income. But once you step down below making that, it's impossible without some sort of assistance. So getting to the assistance, what are the different types of affordable housing? So it all kind of started, and I'll get to this in a second, but public housing is government provided housing. And then there's rental assistance, and most people know that as Section 8. And you either have tenant-based or project-based vouchers. And so if you have a tenant-based voucher, you go out and you find housing, and you're only going to pay 30% of your income, and then this voucher will kind of cover the difference up to the fair market rent. And the project-based voucher stays with the project, similar concept, but the project will take in people at that lower income level and then have that subsidy. So then you have assisted rental housing, which is really the bulk of what we do at Palo Alto Housing, and that uses the low income housing tax credit program. And I'll get into that a little bit more. Then you have inclusionary housing, and this is when local government will say, if you're going to build a market rate building, you have a certain set aside where we're going to require you to provide some level of affordability. And so that can be built into either a rental multifamily project or even like a condo development. And then there's a BMR ownership requirement. And we at Palo Alto Housing actually do administer both of those programs for the city of Palo Alto and Mountain View. And we're expanding to other cities in the Bay Area as well. Then you have land trusts. We don't see these a lot in the Bay because land is frankly too expensive. But you do see this in other places in the country where maybe a government or local agency will buy a piece of land, and then they will own that land and develop it. and then they'll sell the unit so that there's an ownership for the resident, but they still have to sell it at an affordable rate to the next person, or return it to the underlying owner. We also have what's called affordable by design, and this can be very controversial because the idea is that you build micro units, and that by virtue of them being smaller, they're going to be affordable. That kind of goes both ways. Affordable by design, and then tiny homes is sort of in that same vein, but we're seeing this tiny homes concept in other places in the country where land is more affordable. You're able to build a lot of tiny homes on a lot and get a lot of folks housed. We're not really seeing the tiny homes here, at least not yet. This is a brief history of affordable housing, and I don't know a ton about the history of affordable housing, but it really started in the 1900s, and that's the turn of the century, and it's what you think of the blight housing and people living in tenements and just squalor, and the government really felt like we've got to do something about this. And so in 1934, Congress created FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and essentially that was really geared more towards home ownership, and that really helped people with minimum down payments and sort of changed the financial structure of getting a loan. And so all of a sudden people were off to the races to buy homes. It also did sort of aid in the suburban sprawl and the creation of single-family housing everywhere. And then, the urban centers were still continuing to decay. So in 1937, you have the U.S. Housing Act, and now the federal government's getting into the business of building housing for people, which had some pretty interesting outcomes. The federal government hasn't been a particularly good landlord for folks in that sort of arena. And so it sort of started to slide, and they were struggling. The expenses to run these buildings far exceed what you can collect in rent, and so you really saw this. People think of project housing very negatively, and I think this stigma still stays because of really what happened. But so on the way to some of these buildings being demolished, you have Housing and Urban Development Department created on the federal level. But then by 1962, demolition of Pruitt-Igoe, and I believe it was St. Louis. This building was less than 20 years old when they tore it down, and it's this huge, ginormous complex, and all the buildings were demoed simply because it was a disaster. It was crime-ridden. People were living in horrible conditions, and so I think we started to see a shift towards maybe we need the private sector to respond to housing. And so the U.S. Housing Act actually created Section 8, but it wasn't until 1983 that they added the voucher program. And that's when, the vouchers, as I discussed before, those kind of came onto the scene. And then in 1986, you had the Tax Act reform, which created the low-income housing tax credit. And I'll get to that on the next slide. And then locally, I don't know if anybody's familiar, but in 1998, Geneva Towers were demolished in San Francisco, very similar to Pruitt-Igoe, high-density, substandard housing. So with the low-income housing tax credit, basically the idea is that you have an investor who is, usually a financial institution or a bank, and they have a ginormous tax liability because of, all the money that they make. And in order to reduce this tax liability, the IRS allows them through the Section 42 and the Internal Revenue Code, the low-income housing tax credit. The investor can provide capital to an affordable housing developer, and this can be for a rehab, it can be for new development, and they get dollar-for-dollar reduction in their tax liability. So that makes them happy, so that's why you get the smiley face. I do have to give credit to Novogradac. This is their slide, so copyright Novogradac. So I mentioned earlier, the development process for affordable and market rate is very similar. The difference being, obviously affordable, you're going to limit your rents. And so you've got some financial hurdles to get through in that regard. And then also by virtue of doing the tax program, You're going to have some agreements and stipulations, and generally you're going to keep this affordable for 55 years. And those are the big differences. So taking it through the process is by and large the same. So you go through sort of a 3-phase process: pre-development, construction, and property management. During pre-development, this is usually 2 to 5 years. If you're really lucky in a good jurisdiction and you bought the land that's already zoned, maybe it's even entitled, you could get that down to a year. But you're still going through the same process. You're going to do your due diligence. You're going to do your financing feasibility studies. You're going to make sure that the concept works. You're going to start talking to the neighbors. You're going to make sure that the community supports the project. You're going to start working with your city planners and maybe even the state and federal government, sort of depending on how you're going to get your funding. And then through working with your financial sources, you'll really start to identify the population that you're serving, and it varies wildly depending on financials and the location and the need. And so that's a project-to-project type thing. Then you're going to go through an entitlement period and environmental review. And in California, we have CEQA. Excuse me. And so you're going to do possibly a full-blown EIR that's going to add a year or two to your pre-development process if you've got to go through that. Then you're going to have a formal design review. Then once you've gone through all of that, you're going to go through permitting. And in order to get to permitting, you're going to need to generate a set of drawings. Those construction drawings are like this thick. And all of your consultants are on board, all the different engineers. And once you're in the permitting phase, it takes about 6 months to get that set of drawings ready, and then about 3 months to get through the public review. So, all of this takes a tremendous amount of time and effort and money. For us in the affordable arena, we have to do a market study. In the Bay Area, this is a really silly endeavor, but it's required. You want to show your lenders and investors that you're going to be able to keep the building full and have a rapid lease-up period. Obviously, in the Bay Area, we need affordable housing so badly that you can pretty much build anything for any group and fill it up in no time. And then now you have a project that's approved and the market study is good. Then you can go out and get your investor and lenders together. And then you'll enter into the construction period. That's going to take another year to 2 years, usually 2 years. And in the Bay Area, we have a labor shortage. And so it's going to take maybe even longer. So all of this is just to kind of underscore the issue of the housing crisis and the mess we're in and how critical it is when we have a project to move forward very quickly. So then you're finishing up the permit process. You're going to get your certificate of occupancy. Now you can fill the building up, go through the lease-up period, and you've essentially placed in service. And that's the phase where now the tax credit investor is happy because they're getting their tax credit investment dollars back. Then you enter into the property management phase. It's 55 years or longer. Palo Alto Housing, we generally keep our assets. But for an affordable housing developer, there's a committed period of time that it must remain affordable. Interesting thing, now that we're in property management, we're filling this building up. We're talking about 7 years ago from when we bought the property, and a lot's changed. Politics have changed. The target population at the time might not be the population you need to serve in that time. Decisions that were made by either planning commissions or councils or board members or designers or architects or what have you 7 years ago might have been well-intentioned, but now, they might not be applicable. So something to think about. So getting back to where you start, you got to have land, and this is the Silicon Valley. So, an affordable housing developer is competing with, multinational corporations valued in the billions, and they're buying up land and they're bringing in, their management and high-paid, really, successful people, and that attracts the market rate developers, all of this sort of driving up the cost of land. So there's not a lot of land left, and it's incredibly competitive to get whatever scraps are still out there. So back to sort of the zoning and community, and this is not meant to be offensive, so don't be offended. This is just a developer's perspective towards sort of the not in my backyard. But as I mentioned before, and you can see there, that's an aerial shot of the Silicon Valley, and it's very low density. Everything was built out in, like I said, the 60s and 70s, mostly single family homes. And once you have that, it's really hard to change. So when you have opportunity sites in transit-rich locations, it's so critical that we can build and build to higher density. So the financing piece is really complicated, and I won't dive too deep here, but basically when I was talking before about the LIHTC program, that's a federal thing, and the tax credits are federal, but they're administered by state. And they're allocated by each state's population. And so for us, we have the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. And so we work with them. And then when you're coming to get your project, you're going to need an investor for those tax credit dollars. You're also going to need a lender for the construction loan. And then you're going to need a permanent lender on the finance. And that doesn't get you all the way there. That doesn't get you enough money to build the project. There's always a gap, and these gaps are getting bigger all the time with various issues, and I'll get into a little bit more of that in a minute. But usually that remaining gap gets filled by cities, counties, sometimes state agencies, sometimes grants. And all of these different groups have different requirements and different regulations and different standards and different things that they look for. Maybe they have a different population that they're trying to get. And sometimes their requirements can be conflicting. So we're always sort of doing this dance to kind of negotiate our way through that. And that's why that guy's on the strength there. So I mentioned rising construction costs, and this is particularly heartfelt in the Bay Area. And it's sort of a double whammy with the housing crisis. A lot of the trades, they're not super high paid professionals, and it's difficult for them to live anywhere close to where we're going to build in the Silicon Valley. So, we hear about people getting up at like 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning in Tracy and driving down here, which is really sad, but it's a part of the reality that we live in. Construction costs are going up phenomenally because of that labor shortage issue. And there's also sort of this labor shortage issue that was caused by the financial crisis of 2008, where a lot of construction stopped and a lot of people left the industry and they haven't come back. And in the construction industry, there's an apprenticeship program where the younger guys learn from the older generations. And now there's this gap because of sort of what has happened during the financial crisis. And so all these things sort of impact. Also, materials costs have gone up. Any sort of trade war that we engage in will have an impact on material costs for development. And so that's one of the other financial trends. Interest rates have gone up. They're continuing to go up. They're expected to continue to rise. Tax reform does hurt us. It decreased the value of those tax credits. The appetite for investment has started to dry up a little bit. The Community Reinvestment Act requires that banks reinvest in the communities that they work in. So we're lucky that there's a lot of large financial institutions in the Bay Area that will continue to invest in the tax credit program. So it's not going away, but the tax reform hasn't helped it. And I touched on this before about the funding source and the developer and the community all sort of having this tug of war. And I think all of these trends that are happening, are in some ways contributing to that sort of getting worse and people sort of holding their ground a little bit more firmly. So getting into development constraints, as I said before, communities really want to stick to the lower density that they have. And so, we're often asked at Palo Alto Housing, why don't you guys build something lower density? And the reason why we really can't is because the cost of the land, the cost to build the building, all of these things are astronomically high. Not to mention we desperately need more housing. So to build something much smaller seems kind of counterintuitive. But also the cost per unit in the entire development is something that is scrutinized by the investor, it's scrutinized by TCAC, and there are certain thresholds that we can't get through. And it's also an investor interest thing. When you're talking about these huge financial institutions, they're not going to come to the table if you're doing a 40-unit deal. They just aren't. They're not interested in that because they want a big project where they can get a big, return on their money and it's worth their time. Communities frequently want us to overpark our buildings, and there's a constant tug of war on this one as well. And just to kind of give you an idea of the costs, and these are a little bit dated numbers, but this is from Transform. It is available online. They say parking for a simple parking structure is about $50,000 per stall. And if it's underground, it's $80,000 per stall. I think it's much higher than that, honestly. That's a simple site. We rarely get simple sites. Usually it's an oddly shaped site, and so you've got a weird ramp, and you have to remove certain parts of the building to make it work. And so when it's inefficient, it gets really expensive. So funding and source requirements, I've touched on that a little bit, but if they're inflexible and they have certain requirements that compete with other funding sources that we have to work with, it becomes a huge challenge for us, and we have seen this at Palo Alto Housing. We've been very fortunate that we've been able to kind of negotiate our way through it, but sometimes it can kill a deal. The political challenges are ongoing. We have really antiquated zoning and codes that sort of build what we have, but aren't looking that far to the future to build what we need, and really to build what we need now. So, one thing, retail requirements is another one. I love mixed-use buildings. I was educated in planning, and everybody likes the idea like, oh, I can go downstairs and buy orange juice or whatever. That's great when it works. When it doesn't work, it overburdens an affordable housing project. That portion of the project doesn't get funded by tax credits. We have to carve out the cost to build it. We have to carve out the cost to build the parking for that part of the building. We also have to take a percentage of all of the soft costs, so all the architecture, engineering, all the costs. We have to take all of these, and that has to be financed separately. And so you have to find a lender who believes that that amount of money is going to have a return in the retail space. And if you're not in a prime retail location, no one's really wanting to buy in on that idea. So it becomes very difficult. And you find yourself in a position where you're an affordable housing developer and you're trying to subsidize retail, which is an interesting position to be in. And again, the NIMBYism. So it sounds like a lot of doom and gloom, but I'm here to tell you, I love my job. The folks at Palo Alto Housing love their job. We have a very robust pipeline. We're working very hard to provide as much affordable housing to the Bay Area as we can. I was looking at 2 other sites today, trying to figure out how to make them work. It's extremely challenging, but we do have 67 units in Mountain View currently under construction. The property is called Eagle Park, and that's on El Camino Real. Followed by that is 2821 El Camino Real in San Mateo County. It's unincorporated Redwood City. That's another 67 units. That project's entitled, and so we're already moving in the direction of developing that permit set of drawings that I was mentioning. We've got, we lovingly refer to as Taco Bellagio. It's a Taco Bell in Mountain View. It's proposed to be 71 units. That's on a site that's within a precise plan, so we hope to get that one entitled pretty quickly. We're going to a NOFA hearing with the city of Mountain View on that one very soon. We've also got a couple of projects in the Linda Vista neighborhood. 101 units, 72 units. Those sites will have to be rezoned, so it's going to take a lot more time. Wilton Court in Palo Alto is another site that will have to be rezoned and will take a considerable amount of time, particularly being in Palo Alto. That's on El Camino and Wilton Ave. And then we're working with a church in Santa Clara and trying to provide 90 units of senior housing. I don't know, it's stuck for some reason. Oh, here we go. So this is the Eagle Park Apartments that's under construction, 67 units and studios and 1 bedrooms. The lot is just under half an acre. It's an infill site. So FAR is floor area ratio, and for those of you who don't know what that means, it's a way to determine the mass of your building. It's sort of a planner term. But if you have a floor area ratio of 1.0, and if you had no other restrictions on that land, that means you could build a 1-story structure in the entirety of the site. So if you had a FAR of 2, that same site, entirety of the site, 2 stories, that would be your building envelope. In the real world, you have setbacks, you have parking requirements, landscape requirements, outdoor space requirements, light plane requirements, all these additional restrictions on the land. So you're not really going to build that, so it sort of shapes what you can build. And then you've got your parking requirements, obviously. And so this site is actually parked at a 0.46 ratio, and that means there's 0.46 parking stalls per unit. So there's not even 1 car per apartment unit. And this is an approved project already under construction. So this is the one that's entitled. We're on the march to getting those permit drawings ready for you. 67 studios and 1 bedroom. This is Redwood City again. This is just over half an acre, a much larger FAR at 2.9. It does have a little bit higher parking ratio. It's a little bit more suburban location, so it's a 0.81 ratio. Both sites are transit rich, and we work with folks on transportation, and a lot of our residents don't have cars, so it generally works for us. Pre-development is the process that I outlined earlier, and I did mention Wilton Court. So 61 studios is what we proposed there. This one also has sort of a retail requirement that we're not quite sure exactly how that's going to land yet, but just under half an acre. We're trying to keep the FAR under 2.0. We proposed 44 parking stalls or a 0.51 ratio. There's an additional 13 stalls not included in that ratio for the retail space or nonprofit, whatever sort of ends up there. So what works overall, the tax credit program has been monumental in providing a tremendous amount of capital. And so it's worked really well. Gap financing through cities and counties has also really worked well. There's times where it's been difficult, but those relationships have been successful. We've seen them. We continue to work those angles. State and federal sources. Vouchers are phenomenal. If we have vouchers, we can get a mortgage against those vouchers. So it really helps the project. Being in a supportive community is amazing. Mountain View is one of the more supportive, and so that's why you see us doing so much work there. Redwood City, somewhat also. Unincorporated counties are great. They're a lot easier to work in usually. The lender-investor partnerships, particularly because of the Community Reinvestment Act and their requirement to provide capital in the communities in which they work, have been phenomenal. It's also kind of a unique position for them because they're already required to do it and they like to lend money. So you're kind of on the hook to maybe work with them. You don't have to, but that's why banks like the program so much, is because they could possibly be the lender, either in the construction or the permanent financing. So they're very active in the space. They're great to work with. Incentives, density bonus laws. So, if you, the state law is if you build to the underlying zoning and you build a certain percentage of affordable housing, you get a 35% bonus and some breaks on the code. That really only works if the underlying zoning works for you. So that can be a challenge, but it's a great program when that works for you. Inclusionary requirements, and I say some limits here because there's a threshold. If you put too many inclusionary requirements on market rate developer and say you have to provide too much affordable housing, that deal doesn't work for them. They have to go out and get financing as well. And so they have to prove to their investors that they're going to have a significant return for their interest to be worthwhile. And so, you can't push too hard, but it does end up with, a generous amount of units, which we manage at Palo Alto Housing. So this is where we really need help. It's really the policy and the politics and really just getting out there and showing the politicians that, you know, the voice is to be heard. You know, a lot of times we're speaking for folks who aren't in the room. You know, they're maybe not as available to go to city council. But we really need to update our zoning code to allow higher density, especially around transit. We really need an update to CEQA, and I do think that's coming. A lot of politicians have been talking about it, but there's a lot of litigation risk in the CEQA process, and it really hampers projects. You know, the changes to the tax policies have really hurt us, so that's something to be leery of. And really any changes to the LIHTC program in general, we really want to keep an eye on. You know, we push funding sources to be more flexible. I mentioned how they can contradict each other, but it's also difficult to house certain types of populations. We've looked to do adults with developmental disabilities in some of our projects, and that's really been difficult to finance. Some of the funding sources haven't really figured out how to make that work, which is strange, but it's true, unfortunately. The 80 to 120% AMI range is difficult because you can't get tax credits for them. And so they really only work in the inclusionary world. It's possible to do them in an affordable project, in a tax credit project, but you will not get tax credits for them. So you have to carve them out the same way you would carve out retail. And so it works if your project is big enough and can afford to take that hit, or you can finance it or find other funding sources. But you really don't see that because it just doesn't really make sense. But again, you do get the 80 to 120 house in the inclusionary world. And then just a general community understanding around parking, traffic, density. You know, it's all sort of transportation and land use really go hand in hand. And if we can have more robust transit systems, and we've got some really good ones, maybe they need improvement, but you really want to concentrate the density around those areas where people don't need cars. You know, the people are here, more people are coming, so really just an effort to build more housing all around is truly what we need. So with that, I turn it over to you guys, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, yeah. Oh, actually, I did want to mention, we're doing this storytelling effort at Palo Alto Housing. And essentially what this is a lot of folks in need of affordable housing don't show up to the city council hearings and planning and transportation commission hearings. And their voices really aren't heard. And it could be folks on the waiting list, folks interested in housing. And so we're doing an email list where we're going to just let people know when their voices can be heard. You know, if we're going to planning commission, if we're going to city council, we'll send out an email. If you can go and you want to speak, that's great. If you don't feel like speaking or you can't go, we'll give you enough information that you can write a great letter. So you had a question?
Yeah. Not sure if this is working. My question is, can you build a project without LIHTC? Is that sort of fundamental to pretty much making any project work?
Can you build a project without LIHTC? I mean, it's possible. It's not likely.
Okay.
You know, I think we're seeing now the Valco project, right? And it's this market rate developer who's saying he's going to build 50% affordable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason is because part of the SB 35, if you do 50% and 80% area median income, you still qualify. And as I said before, that's a section that doesn't qualify for tax credits, but that's such a massive project and has so many other moving parts. It's got like a theater and retail and office. And so it's got enough pieces to generate enough financing that I think that project's probably not looking for LIHTC. It wouldn't be. I mean, if that's what they're going to do. So it is possible. It's a lot more challenging. You really need a huge project.
Are there any other questions? I can pass the microphone. Okay. Sorry, back here. Here and then.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, yeah. I'm wondering if you've, in your experience
the land issue or the financing, like jigsaw puzzle, is typically the more challenging, like the bigger challenge. Like if, I guess, but I'm thinking if Stanford University, for example, were to say, we'll give you a huge thing of land or we'll finance a building, like what would kind of clear the most obstacles for you?
So land really hasn't been an issue for us. We have a big enough portfolio that we can borrow against, and we've been pretty aggressive in acquiring sites. But we have to behave differently than a market rate developer because we're competing with market rate developers. When we get a land donation, that's fantastic. So if you've got land, I want to talk to you. And it does happen. Like I said earlier, we're working with a church and trying to kind of partner with them and develop a piece of their property and add affordable housing. So land really hasn't been our biggest hurdle. Really, our biggest hurdle is really the community and the process and then NIMBYism.
So politics.
Politics, yeah.
I just wondered, specifically with regard to Palo Alto, you mentioned the waiting list previously. How many people are on the waiting list in Palo Alto? Do you have any idea?
Do you know about it?
Yeah. So what Danny didn't mention is that, by the way, I'm Lauren. I'm the below market rate administrator for the cities of Mountain View and Palo Alto. Essentially, there are 22 properties that Palo Alto Housing manages. Each one of them has their own separate waiting list at the property. And the reason they do that is so that they can help different folks at different income limits. And so that's for the 100% affordable properties where each unit is affordable housing. So there are hundreds and hundreds of people on those lists collectively. Obviously, there's some crossover there, but each property manages their own waiting list. And the lists are years long, which isn't to say you shouldn't apply. If you need housing, you should still apply because there is hope, time will pass, and your number will be called, but it's hard. And for the inclusionary programs that Danny mentioned, that I administer, there's rental and there's ownership programs. For the rental, same thing goes. Each property maintains their own waiting list. For the ownership program, I am currently selling a home to a family that has literally been waiting 21 years on the waiting list. The last home I sold to somebody, their parents were in housing at Palo Alto Housing because they were a younger immigrant couple who came over and needed help to kind of get set up. And so they told their kid, who on her 18th birthday, to get on the waiting list. So I just closed that home. She's 37 now. So that's the ownership program. The rental program moves a lot faster, but it's still slow because what you have is a portion of the property that's allocated for the units. So it's a lot smaller, which is why you need all sorts of types of housing to help address different income levels. That answer question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a board member of a Loan Services and Community Working Group, and we develop permanent supportive housing for people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. Now to my question. As a refugee from market-rate housing, what do you think some of the challenges are for market-rate housing developers to consider deep and appropriate partnering with affordable housing organizations?
So when I was at Essex, there was actually a partnership between Essex and Bridge Housing on a project in San Francisco. You've got Related, who does both in-house. Anton also does both in-house. So those partnerships exist. The challenge is it's a financial issue for a market rate developer. It's the rents, particularly the rent growth, is what really drives the financial pro forma when you're underwriting a market rate deal. And so, they're looking at the high cost of land, the high cost of construction, and then if they are limited on their ability to grow rents, it's difficult to borrow for that project. And so that's the issue. And I looked at that so many times when I was in the market rate world and just trying to see where that number is. Like, how many BMRs can we really get in this project? Like, what is a real threshold? And, it depends on the project, certainly, and the financial fundamentals of the deal. But it kills it really fast. I mean, you add a few and you start to limit and they look at what's the rate of return, and that shrinks rapidly once you start limiting the rent growth. Because it's the rent growth over time that really drives the value. So that's where it's difficult. Where it works is when you have enough land to have a big enough site. That's where it really works. In the market rate world, they really like to separate things. I think most people think of inclusionary, they want it all to be incorporated. And so there's a struggle there too, because they're marketing to, the luxury tenant, and there's sort of a aversion to having anything less than that. So there's definitely a struggle. I've lived in projects that had inclusionary housing, and I never noticed like any difference ever. So I think it just depends on how it's managed. So it can be done. It can be done successfully. Hopefully we see more of it. I think you will as time moves on, and particularly in large scale projects.
Yes.
And then I'm gonna actually ask if anybody on the other side.
If there were no zoning constraints, is there a level of density at which you could build affordable housing, I'd say at the various levels, without subsidy? In other words, if you literally could build, 20, 30, 40 stories.
Interesting question. And again, I think it goes back to the scale, right? So if you have enough other things going on in that project or property, that can sort of help to kind of take up that burden. If you've got office particularly, Palo Alto really is limiting how much office you could do. But if they allowed for a creative infusion of an office development with affordable housing, I think people would have an appetite for that. I mean, people really want to build office space here. So I think that would be one angle, because you're going to have some way to sort of leverage that loss.
So they're, in effect, you're saying there really is, subsidies has to come from somewhere.
Exactly.
Hi, I found it really interesting when you said your biggest challenge isn't finding all the land, but it was the politics. My impression over the past several years is that because of the tech companies hiring so many employees, everyone's flocking to the Bay Area. Do these companies do anything at all to kind of help with that process? Where do they think all their new hires will be living?
They're starting to. Facebook and Google are both proposing and building large projects with multiple housing. I don't know a ton about what the tech industry does in that regard, but we're starting to see some of it. But it's really coming from the larger end of the scale. We don't see it as much in like the startup side of things.
I live in Menlo Park and I'm on our housing commission. And so Facebook is proposing to include housing in their big development, but it's only a fraction of the need. And so I sit and I ask the for-profit developers, can you do more BMR units in this? And they say, no, it doesn't pencil out. When I see the chart you showed about number of jobs coming into a community and number of homes being developed, I mean, that doesn't pencil out. So how, this isn't really your job, but like, how do we, yeah. But you said you have a perspective I don't have. How do we get out of this pickle or at least stop making it worse? Because even Facebook, who's being praised for including housing in their project, is making the situation worse. How do we stop doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that they're doing that. I agree. It would be great to see more. There's really no silver bullet, in my opinion. And from a developer perspective, it's frustrating that a developer gets tasked with solving all of society's ills. It's a bigger issue than really any one particular project should be tasked with solving. It's not just a housing developer, it's also an employer, like you mentioned. So it kind of goes both ways. I think the government has a hand in helping too. So there's multiple ways to kind of tackle the problem. And where we are today, we have to do everything as much as we can, full speed ahead.
Can I just say one thing about that?
Yeah.
Which is, I don't think companies control land use, local governments do. And so I actually don't know what the answer is either, but I guess I feel like if a company has a piece of land, if like they own it outright, it's not like they can decide what they can do with that. It's zoned for something, and the local government ultimately controls that. So it's just looking at how
I know I asked an
Yeah.
impossible question.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, going back to the discussion on inclusionary zoning, as you know, if a developer does not want to include units, the developer could pay a housing impact fee.
Right.
And that's where the city or the county gets the money to provide that gap financing that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Would you address the tension between units versus the fees, the units on site, and how sometimes the fees can provide more units to create more housing units?
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand what you're asking. For us, the benefit of getting those inclusionary dollars, the in lieu fee dollars are invaluable. I mean, it's crucial. So it's extremely helpful. And from my perspective, all housing is helpful because it increases supply. So if a market rate developer comes in and would rather pay the in lieu fee, that's still a great benefit to us as affordable housing developers. If they decide to provide the BMR units on site, I think that's a great benefit to the community. And it also goes to, a different sort of section where you get more of the 80 to 120 range. Whereas we're going to build, 60 or below, generally speaking. What's different though between the two is if we build it, we've got resident services and we provide other benefits to the residents that live in that community. Whereas if you're a BMR tenant living in a market rate building, they don't really provide anything additional to you. Does that answer your question?
It's also less units generally.
It's less units. It can be, it just depends.
So you talk about the future rents being, something that the financing for market rate developers hinges upon. How do you think the possible repeal of Costa-Hawkins and city's ability to impose rent control on those new units might change that game?
It certainly will change that game. We've seen in Mountain View, particularly, a lot of smaller multifamily owners are really trying to get out of the game, but they're having a really hard time unloading their assets because not a lot of people want to buy a rent-controlled building. It's interesting too. I mean, I worked. When a unit becomes vacant in a rent control building, you get to move it to market. So it still kind of becomes unaffordable over time anyways. And so they would put huge capital improvements in the building, which is great because you need, more often than not, these old buildings in rent control have deferred capital improvements and they're sort of falling down. So they came in and fixed it up. That renovation process alone scares people off. People move out. In San Francisco, you have people that hunker down no matter what. But anytime there's a vacancy, it goes to market. And so there's an extra pressure because the supply gets constrained even further. It's a very complex and complicated issue. So I think that's all I can really speak to on that one.
My name is Bob Stromberg. I work with Destination Home to end homelessness in Santa Clara County. One response to the previous question is commercial linkage fees that cities are looking at. I think it's going to be a political issue in many of our cities coming up, so that new commercial construction helps to pay for some of the new housing that we need. My two questions are related, and it's about land. One is, do you see any cooling in the market rate rental market? So are rents increasing less than in recent years? And will that have potentially a positive impact on the ability of affordable housing developers to acquire some land that commercial developers pull out on? Will that be a good thing? And on a related issue about land, is Palo Alto Housing looking aggressively at all at, say, you showed the map of all of the low density throughout our region, at, say, for example, a nonprofit organization or a for-profit business that's has a one-level building that you could enter into an agreement in order to build up and then place them in the ground floor. And sort of around that, what are the restrictions? What's the difficulty in doing that?
So to the first part of your question, yes, rents are cooling, and land costs haven't caught up to that, and construction costs haven't caught up to that either. So a lot of market rate deals have stalled. Some of them have been pulled. I don't know if you saw the 1,200 units pulled from South San Francisco recently. I think that's really starting to happen more frequently. I know another developer that's selling a lot of their entitled projects as well. Hopefully that has a benefit to us, but it really will only benefit us if the land costs and construction numbers catch up, from my perspective. The second part of your question, no, we don't do that. It's not to say that we couldn't. I think that's an interesting solution. It's just not the focus of our business. We're a nonprofit. We have a small team. We're pretty honed in on doing tax credit on the new development side, and then we're also doing the BMR program on the other side. There are certainly people who are doing what you're talking about. The difficulty, is engaging on the smaller scale is incredibly tough because you still have to go through the same process. So you still have to hire the architect and the engineers and the consultants, and you still go through a very lengthy process and through a really hard-won political process too a lot of times, and people get burnt out when it's too small. So it's really a scale issue. But it's not to say that people aren't doing it. I wish we would see more of it. I think in California, you have to have, we call it pay to play. You have to have, a lot of capital. You have to have a lot of nerve. And you're not going to see a lot of like mom and pop developers doing, sort of that like one-off type thing as frequently here as you see in other parts of the country. And that's a shame. I think that's where hopefully policy can sort of step in and the government can help to sort of change that to improve that paradigm. Sure.
Yeah, I have a question about the availability of land. I know that Stanford has a lot of land and they build a lot of housing, which they don't sell the land to their employees, I guess, or their faculty. There's also a large tract of land at Moffett Field. Is there any way to get, there are large tracts of land that are kind of empty and not owned by commercial developers. Could you just comment on that and how it might be possible to find more land that's out there?
So we don't have any control over what Stanford does with Stanford's land. Obviously, it's up to Stanford and really the county of Santa Clara. There is a Stanford general use permit that gets updated, and I think they just completed their EIR. And the county planners study, sort of the impacts of what their activity is and their growth. And they make sort of a determination on either what their contribution will be towards generating affordable housing, or if they're going to be building various housing on their land. To speak to Moffett, there was an RFP put out by, I'm not sure which government agency owns Moffett, I think it's NASA. They had an RFP, they're developing some of that land. We looked into it, but it was just way above us. It's just such a massive project. We're not that big of a builder, or developer rather. So we didn't get involved in that RFP process, but it's out there. It's complicated because, it's not the cleanest site, but it can be done and people are going to do it. And then to speak to sort of some of the other sort of raw land areas in the Bay Area, they're environmentally sensitive, they're away from transit. Going through the CEQA process makes them incredibly painful to develop. And, I don't really think you should develop them. I think there's enough infill sites around transit that we need to focus on as a priority. But there certainly are opportunities.
So I understand that you rely heavily on the tax credits. Does Palo Alto Housing ever do projects that include units above that 80% or 60% average AMI? And if so, what would lead you to do that?
So we haven't. Historically, we do look at it frequently. We call it the missing middle because it's that sort of gap between sort of what tax credit provides and kind of where you land on the market rate side. And we look at it all the time. It's just so difficult because the value of those tax credits are phenomenal. It's money that you don't have to pay back. It's not a loan. It's capital that gives the investor a tax credit. So it's like the best money for a developer. It's not easy to get. You have to jump through a lot of hoops, but you don't have interest on that. So taking that away is extremely painful and makes the project really difficult. You need some other form of really creative finance, which, you're not able to pay that down. So that's sort of the rub. We keep looking at it. If you can get free land, then that'll help. So if someone donates the land, if you're, have, like I said before, a big project and there's a huge scale to it, that's another angle. We aren't really large enough as a developer yet to kind of go in that direction. There are people that are, so that is something that's going to start to happen more frequently.
So the higher rents that you would get at that 120% AMI level don't go far enough to make it worth.
No.
Do you know if there are any other low income or
population is the inclusionary housing and the market rate development. And that's usually 80 to 120. And so that's where you see that. And I know that the project at Page Mill and El Camino right over here is sort of workforce housing, and they are providing a set aside for, I believe, 120.
I think they're at 140 and
140.
Yeah.
And so it does get sort of back down to that level. So it's happening. It's very small, incrementally happening. But it's more of an inclusion. It's more likely as an inclusionary. I mentioned earlier the tax credit program does allow us to go up to 80%. That's a very recent change. So we've been looking at that and trying to see where that works because we believe in providing as much at different levels as we can. So more to come, I think. If you watch us, we'll probably get some of those, I think. over time.
So it's very interesting that you do not perceive the land to be your biggest challenge, but rather it is a policy and politics. So when you go before the city council and pushing for your project, can you put a dollar sign if there is a delay because there is this, your project being modified, being rejected, and do you ever face such a challenge that you essentially abandon your project?
The delays are, it'll vary project to project. Just to speak to that generally, it's usually, you kind of project out what your timeline is going to be. And that's what you tell your lender. And you build this schedule as a team, and that's what you work towards. So those delays mean more interest payments. And these are big loans, right, to take down the land. So they're big interest payments. So that's really the dollar sign. It's also the added effort and time and staff, paying staff, paying consultants, all of that adding up and you're not getting there. We're also in a phase in the cycle where every day that goes by, construction costs continue to go up. So that's another thing that's you can't put a dollar sign to that because you don't know, and you don't have a crystal ball because you don't know when that's going to dip back down. But it's something that makes everybody nervous, and we're just, we plan out financially what it's going to take to build a project, how long and when, and we also try to make a prediction on where the costs are going to rise to so that we know when we hit that point in time, we can make those numbers. All those delays make all of that change, right? So we can generally give ballpark numbers, but there are so many other factors that come into play that we aren't, we're not psychic enough.
I have a couple, 2-3 questions, and so is it 50 to 80% or 60 to 80% is your kind of sweet spot for your tax credit?
For us, we really do anything 30 to 60. So
60 to 80. I didn't know if I had that down right. Are you building also for very low and extremely low?
We are, yeah.
Oh, good. And I know you have in the past, but you're still doing that.
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, so you have something complete. The ongoing subsidy, so this is below market rate housing, but then you have to continue to subsidize people being there. Could you say just a little bit about that? Because you have extremely low people, very low people, and low income people. So can you talk about your responsibility for ongoing subsidy of the people that live there for, you do 55 years out now, right?
Yep. So
can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. That's a complex one to answer, but I'll try. So one of the biggest pieces is if you have vouchers, so that makes it a lot easier. Generally, when we have vouchers, it's going to be the 30% AMI folks. The vouchers help because they pay the gap between that and fair market rent. So that makes it really easy if you can get the vouchers. Vouchers are harder to come by.
This is a project voucher?
There are two types of vouchers. You've got the project vouchers and you've got the tenant vouchers. We would accept either of them, and they're both very helpful in sort of filling that gap. The lower AMI ranges, and this is where it gets very complicated, but you can get extra points in the way they assess the tax credit the long haul. So you don't usually see that being a large number unless you have a large amount of subsidy, the vouchers.
And that's all loaded in upfront. Like when you're doing this, all of your financing, all of this stuff, that is all an upfront thing. This whole subsidy out for 55 years is an upfront thing that you're doing.
That's right.
That's just amazing.
Yeah.
I would like to say. That is amazing, Danny. And one last question. And it seems like your sweet spot, that has been talked about in the past is around 60 units?
To be honest, the sweet spot is really around like 100 units. But we've been finding more half-acre sites, and it's too difficult to build usually 100 units on a half-acre site.
Yeah.
For us, there's different construction types, and they change based on the building height. And once you go over really like 5 stories, you're changing your building type, and the cost to build that building type goes up tremendously. And so that has a huge impact on, how much density we can afford to build. And so that's why, like, it seems like our sweet spot is like 60 units, but on an operational, like long term, it's better to get closer to 100 because of what I was saying about, the expenses of a project continue to grow over time. And then you've got your rents that are limited. They're only allowed to grow a little bit. And so that the expenses will eventually outpace the income, and you really have to pay attention to that. And so if you have a larger project, your property manager, you probably pay them the same, and your landscaper and all, your elevator contract, all these different costs, you've got more units to spread out. Does that make sense? So the sweet spot is usually like 100 to 120 realistically. It's just our sweet spot because of our small infill sites is really like 70-ish.
And then can I just ask one last thing? And so in a project, you normally would try for a variation of extremely low, and very low incomes, kind of, it would be a mashup.
They're usually
That's all my questions.
They're usually a mixture.
Thank you.
And for just a lot of different reasons, but it's also easier for the lease-up process. You can fill it a lot faster because you're not moving to the next person because of income qualification limitations. So that's another advantage to having sort of a range.
So I don't want to keep you here forever, although we could probably stay here forever. We've got a couple, one here, one in the middle, and then one more down at the end, and I think maybe that'll be it, and we'll leave a little time to kind of mingle.
Sure.
Thanks, yeah. I've been noticing that a lot of the NIMBYism that you might encounter has to do with a fear or a concern about traffic and particularly parking. And I was wondering if you had something that you say to people to try to calm them down about that fear and concern.
So, yeah, I mean, that's the number one comment at City Council for market rate or affordable. And it's easier on the affordable side because we have our portfolio, we know what we're parked at, we know our projects where they are overparked. There's just spaces that aren't being used. We have spaces that we rent out to other folks. We share that information with people. People hear what they want to hear sometimes. Unfortunately, for all these projects, we have to do a traffic study. So there's no getting out of, what those impacts will be. There'll be an engineer to assess that. There's ways to mitigate the impacts. We also do transit passes sometimes for the residents where, if you live in the building, we give you a free VTA transit pass, those types of things. It gets complicated because, as I was talking before about expenses growing faster than your income, that's a pretty big expense. So you have to really look at, okay, how long can we really do this program? But when you have people in the 30% area median income, the cost of a private vehicle is extremely expensive for them. So if they live in an area where they have rich access to transit, that's going to be their mode of transportation, and they're not going to have a car. We're also looking at doing like motorcycle parking more frequently. Maybe that's scooters too, I don't know. But so those are the things that we look at. That's what we try to tell the community. We share all of the studies. It's all public information. But people have sometimes made up their mind before they come to that conversation, unfortunately.
So I've sort of been following the coin store site, Wilton. Right?
Yep.
So when you originally went to the city, it was taller, right? You shaved a story off your ass. With Olive Ave maybe going into the Ventura plan, are you going to try to get that back on the table?
The extra story?
Yeah.
Probably not, to be honest. We've worked really closely with the neighbors and really have the building in just a general mass that really fits the neighborhood context. We would certainly love to build more, but we have a project that we feel like the neighborhood would support. I don't think that they would really be happy if we went the other direction with them. And it's been a challenge. We've been working for a long time and really hard and having several meetings with community members. So honestly, I don't think so. What we really are trying to work with on that one is more flexibility in terms of the retail. It's not a great site for retail.
It's a horrible site for retail.
Yeah.
It's like the worst site. I live right there. Nobody goes.
So just, I mean, we currently subsidize the rents. We currently subsidize the rents for the folks that are already there because we're a nonprofit. We bought the site for the purposes of building affordable housing. So we didn't move in and move everybody to market. Everybody that's there has been paying the same rent that they've been paying since they've been there, which is nuts. But people don't understand that and they feel like we're taking that away from the community, but that really wouldn't even exist if we hadn't bought the site. So it's kind of a double-edged sword on that one.
I just wanted, I spoke already, I realized, but I wanted to follow up on your question about the amount of power here. On the building types, I've been aware of this cost difference, but say, take that example of this half-acre site that you go to 62 units because that's what you can do with the one building type. What is the cost difference? Can you put is it 2 million? Is it 7 million? Is it, what's the cost? What additional gap funding would be required to allow the different construction type to go from 62 to 120?
It varies dramatically. That's a really difficult question to answer. It's really hard to answer that question.
Yeah.
It's a big change. So when you go, so essentially type 5 construction is wood-built construction. It's like a house, right? You can go up 5 stories in wood and you don't have any structural issues. When you start going over that, you start to have structural issues. You need to start introducing steel into the building, concrete into the building. Those are very expensive building materials. There are tons of trades that have to work with those materials. And you can't make changes. It's very rigid. If you build a wood frame building and you realize, oh, we have to do plumbing through here and they mess all this up, you can really easily move wood around. You cannot move steel and concrete around very easily. So it's hard to express in terms of, is it 2 million, is it 3 million? Because it varies wildly depending on the site. But it is a very significant difference. And then, so the next type you would go to is type 3, introducing concrete and steel. The type 1 is all concrete and steel, so high rise or luxury office building. That's by far the most expensive. And that's what we would have to build anyways for the ground floor if there's cars being parked there and it's sort of a type 1 already. So that box is already very expensive. And then we build a concrete podium and then we build our wood frame on top of the concrete podium. That's generally what we do for these infill sites. The easiest way to build affordable housing is if you can do concrete slab on grade and you can park cars out on surface parking. It's a lot less expensive, but it's a lot more suburban and you don't really get the density.
Thanks.
Sure.
Was there any one? Okay, last question, and then I think we're gonna.
Just an example, I can't even imagine in Palo Alto, but that would be me, which is there like a 100-unit apartment building here? Like here on, like the ones they're building right now, right down the road there, are those 100 unit? The ones right across from California Avenue, between here and California Avenue.
The one that was done?
On El Camino Road. Yeah.
That's 60. Yeah, the Mayfield project, 67.
don't know what she's talking
Is there an example of a 100 unit building in this town?
Not affordable.
Not affordable.
Oh, thank you.
Channing House is
No.
is 90, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for coming. If you guys want any more snacks, there's plenty of snacks left, and we'll